My next storyteller, Marny Williams, is the co-founder of the Hummingbird Center for Hope. She is someone I respect and admire. So when she sent me a message to say, I'd love to contribute a mom story right after I announced my Mothertelling vision, I knew I was on the right path. So if you haven't used up all your Kleenexes, there are a few more boxes. Candace has some there. Whew. Here is Marny Williams and her story, Forging Away.
I actually used to say my superpower was making people cry, so. This was where we had met. I'd come down to the river valley to watch friends ride in their kayaks and rafts, ride the rapids, portage out, and repeat. I had zero intention of partaking, just sitting on the shoreline watching the antics and enjoying the sun. But somehow I ended up in this raft with this guy named Keith, and I can still hear him yelling at me, "Paddle, Marny, paddle," as we propelled our way through the rapids. I had zero idea what I was doing, let alone that I would marry this guy, Keith. I was just following instructions and hoping to stay alive. Keith was never one to do normal. Wait a minute. Now here, off to a good start. Now here I was again on that exact same spot 7 years ago. I'd just been dropped off on the Trans-Canada Highway just outside of Lake Louise. My 3-month-old daughter was in her car seat and my dog Nelson was on his leash. The van doors closed and off sped my brother with the promise to come pick me up in a few hours. Keith was never one to do normal. He loved it best when he forged his own way and created his own path. And I remember on our first road trip when we were cruising down the highway of the interior BC in his Dodge Red Caravan. It was nighttime and he just suddenly pulled over and announced, "This is where we're sleeping tonight." And we were new to dating and I thought, what the heck have I gotten myself into? I was pretty sure we were going to be woken up by the RCMP and being charged with trespassing, or worse yet, by a grizzly bear who was trying to break in looking for breakfast. Keith loved adventure. He loved being surrounded by Mother Nature, and he loved to swim in cold, clear glacier water. He loved to hike the mountains, and I soon realized that the two of us had very different hiking styles. The higher up the mountain he went, the faster he got, and the higher up the mountain I went, the slower I got. And I soon realized that once I broke the tree line, that I would set up my little picnic, I would have my snacks and my camera and my book, whatever I needed, tell Keith to keep going, and really cross my fingers that he would pick me up on the way back down. I had my binoculars, so I was able to watch him traverse the mountainside as he climbed up, and often held my breath as he took unnecessary risks as he was climbing. And I actually held a deep fear that he would die on a mountain one day. But the world had different plans for us. He died after a 6-week battle with cancer. My son was 3 years, and my daughter was 3 months old. I made it back to that exact same spot by the river where Keith and I had met 7 years ago. Placed my daughter down in her car seat, grateful that she was asleep. Nelson was now off leash, loving life, roaming through the riverside. The sun was out and it was glistening off the water, and I was grateful for the sound of the rushing water as it drowned out my tears. On the other side of the river were train tracks, and as the freight train came by, it blew its whistle, and the eerie sound of it echoed in the valley. It was time, and I realized that in all that I had packed, I hadn't packed water shoes. So I left my socks on in the hopes of gaining some traction as I worked my way out into the river to about 10 feet off where there was a rock. Nelson, our dog, who wasn't about to miss out on the action, decided to join me, and the two of us were precariously balanced on this rock that was hardly made for one. Quickly opened the bag, scattered my husband's ashes, and watched them dissipate in the turbulent yet crystal clear water. I knew I had to get back to shore quickly because I could no longer feel my feet. They were frozen. And I was actually afraid that something else bad was going to happen and my daughter would be found by a random hiker on the side of the shore. As I sat and warmed my feet, I wondered how a day, the exact same day, could be one where it was the joy and the happiness of having some fun and meeting my husband, and be the same day where I was embarking on the impossible, scattering his ashes and starting a grief journey that changed my entire world. I used to love sitting on the carpet and watching my son drive his Hot Wheels along the pattern of the rug, using it as his road. And now as I sat there, I wondered, and I had great questions going through my head and wondering what the future was going to look like. How was I going to be a solo widowed parent? How was I going to financially support my kids? How was I going to explain death and dying to my children? And how was I going to keep their dad's memory alive? I did my best. I shared stories and I encouraged others to do the same. I taught my kids about grief as much as they taught me. But as their grief changed and evolved, soon their questions and their curiosity about their dad, who he was and how he died, soon those stories weren't enough and my kids wanted more. My daughter wanted to meet her dad. She wanted to get to know him. And in grief, there's only one thing that will take away a heartache, and that is to bring your person back to life. And that's the one thing that I couldn't do. So I did the next best thing. I bought us 2 tickets out west and lovingly called the trip, Meet My Dead Dad. Gotta have dark humor in grief, that's all I have to say. And now I was back venturing to that exact same spot that I'd stood on 14 years ago. I've traveled the Trans-Canada Highway between Calgary and Lake Louise hundreds of times, but this was my first time back in over a decade. The landscape and the terrain had changed. What once used to be easy access to the river was now blocked by this fence that protected the wildlife from the tourists, or maybe the other way around. What once was a single highway was now a divided highway traveled by many more cars. And what would have been an easy access was now going to be difficult. And Keith would have loved this. He would have loved that this journey was not going to be easy, and that Taylor and I were going to have to forge a way into the unknown, into the spot back. As we drove along, I was hoping to be able to find a spot where we would be able to get to the other side of the river that didn't require Taylor and I climbing the fence, or worse yet, squeezing through a little tiny spot. And knowing my luck, the RCMP would show up. And I was beginning to wonder if I was going to be destined to have my mugshot hanging in the local detachment. Thankfully, we found that spot. There was a gate and we were able to cross and join where the animals roamed wild. We began our trek. My backpack was full. Diapers had been replaced by toilet paper because Girl Guides taught me to always be prepared. We had a plethora of snacks. We had our camera, we had roses, and this time we had a container that held the ashes of our dog, Nelson. See? My daughter was no longer in that car seat. She was now following along behind me and dropping rose petals onto the path as we went. Her eyes were to the ground. Her body was heavy and somber, and she was dragging her feet along. And I was grateful once again for the rush of the water as it drowned out both my thoughts and my tears, because I could only imagine what was going through her mind because my mind was on overdrive. We made it. The train returned, blew its whistle as if to welcome us back. I can still feel the cushion under me on those, as I sat on the couch in those days and weeks after Keith died, wondering how I was going to make it to tomorrow. I made a million parenting mistakes as I fumbled along in the dark. I yelled at my kids for being kids. I lost my cool more than once. I used to try and give myself timeouts, but my kids wouldn't let me. I cried and I cried some more. I used to joke that I wasn't going to be up for Parent of the Year until 2030. It's getting close. Grief was too hard. This was too overwhelming. It was too exhausting. I wanted my old life back. I wanted to run away. I wanted Keith. On the outside, it looked like I knew what I was doing, but on the inside, I was a complete mess. And as the doors closed and the lights turned off, my emotions would swell, and the true impact of my grief was felt in isolation and in solitude. But I did the best I could. I put one foot in front of the other. I stuck to it, if not for anybody, but for my kids. People said I was strong, and this made me laugh because most days I felt so fragile and so weak. People asked me how I did it. I have no idea. I just did. I was forging my own way into this wilderness of grief. This moment, this trip was for my daughter. It was for her to get to know her dad, to feel connected to him, to know where he was. I left this entire ritual up to her. I was just the chauffeur. And as I sat and watched Taylor and her ceremony unfold, she walked the shoreline. She walked the shoreline. She picked up rocks in the water. She splashed. She dropped her rose petals into the water and watched them dance amongst the rapids. And then the time came. And we each took turns now scattering Nelson's ashes into the water, just as I had done with Keith's 14 years earlier. And then my daughter announced it was time to go. This time, she led the way. She navigated the way back to the car. I followed her. But this time, she wasn't dragging her feet. The weight of her grief had been lifted, and I would actually say she was floating. And in that moment, I knew that the worry, the anxiety, the fear, the sleepless nights had all been worth it. And in that moment, I knew that the fight I had fought to give my kids the best life possible without their dad physically present had been worth it. And in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay, that I had done a good job at being a solo parent. And the weight of my worry lifted, and perhaps I too started to float out. I have always felt Keith's spirit with us. He was definitely there that day, and he wrapped the two of us in love. He shows up when needed, but quite often sits quietly in the background, which is where he should be. Love him. But as we walked back to the car, we had to traverse a small gully by using a log. And as my foot stepped on the log, it just as quickly slipped off and the world slowed down. And all that went through my mind was, save the photos, save the camera. And as my ass hit the log and my feet sunk into the soupy mess below, I knew it was Keith that had pushed me off that log. And just as he had said all those years ago, paddle, Marny, paddle, this was him saying, I miss you too.